was it this experience of falling into depression and everything, really the only source or motivation that led you to metaphysics, or was there another interest in metaphysics somehow?
Well, that's the thing is, I didn't know it was metaphysics until long after. Like, I never picked up a book of philosophy until after I'd already, probably 6 months or something after I'd already fully formalized the idea. Um, so it wasn't, I didn't even have a name for it. It was just something I was doing. And it was something I was doing because it was related to this existential dilemma. I'd started the task in relation to the existential dilemma, and then at a certain point it transformed because I started getting somewhere, and that was really exciting. And actually, it turns out I have kind of a talent for philosophy, specifically dialogue, like question and answer with someone else who's really smart. I really know how to get somewhere. I've got a thing with questions. I'm very good at finding the correct questions that in some sense, make the answer just fall out of them. Yeah. So, like, what it definitely wasn't any kind of like interest in that respect, because I didn't even know what metaphysics was, and I certainly didn't have any interest in philosophy. It was just something I did. Yeah, I didn't understand what it was that I was doing. It was just something that I was doing.
Interesting.
It's
Yeah.
really
See,
interesting as well. It seems to be there's some kind of level of purity to your model, like not being influenced by a bunch of previous readings and
Oh
things.
yeah, that's something that actually I am quite proud of, and it's a theme I've elaborated in other works. The originality thing. I really consider myself quite an original thinker, although these days I take a lot more from other people. But I really do think that there is merit in, like, keeping the tabula rasa as clean as possible. Because people have a habit, especially in philosophy, but in general, people have a habit of learning schemas for conceptually organizing phenomena and then picking the one they like the best and applying that. So when you ask them a question about say some area of metaphysics, what they'll do is they'll give you a scripted answer according to the system they learned that they like the best. Now, there's something about that that's not even thinking at all, really. You know, like,
yeah.
especially if you're having a conversation with someone who's got their own model, right? To sort of, I guess, parrot kind of formulas that would have been derivative from a system that someone really did once hold, like a living, breathing man once held. To me, there's something about it that's like so insincere that it's almost gross. Because it's like a real conversation in that sense isn't really possible unless the other person is able to get past that. And my experience is the more well educated someone is on philosophy, generally the harder it is to get past that compulsive tendency to frame things in terms of conceptual categories that you already know.
Yeah. I mean, I've been trying to find other people that agree with that for a long time. That's what's cool about this community. But the nice thing is, unfortunately, when I was younger, I had a bit more immaturity where I was like, okay, anti-academic, they're all, but really there is value in learning and, standing on the shoulders of giants in a way. But unfortunately, yeah, you lose that tabula rasa and the benefits of that, of finding an original path and a new way that might lead to entire new fields that never previously existed, right? And so that's what I like about Alex. He has some he's very well read, very well studied, but open minded and understands the concept you've just explained, and so it is quite of a powerful force. He may not speak that much, but in the things that he says, you can tell that he understands exactly what you're talking about and how it fits and is relevant to anything else that he has read. And this is what I've noticed about Alex, and that's what I appreciate about this community is that people typically they leave that kind of status stuff aside and really just pursue ideas. And if they do see someone stumbling in the dark a little bit, they don't, really chastise them too much. I mean, I don't know. There's other stuff that goes on in this community as well, and people are just sort of doing the whole monkey ego thing, of course. But I know exactly what you're talking about, and it does reflect in your work, which is why, like, I think we all so quickly reached out and we're like, hey, man, like, we got to talk to you. And I don't think we've really. Oh, I can only speak for myself. I haven't read everything, but from what I read, there was a lot of sort of axiomatic questions that we've been debating for the last year or so, and that nothingness one was the one that we had initially really stumbled upon. Can you first, though, before we delve into that stuff, can you give a bit of a comprehensive explanation of what your theory is, if you would?
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks.
So, I mean, it's really just 3 steps. First step is the refutation of nothingness. So it's basically the idea that, like, when we're asking questions of ultimate beginnings or ultimate origins, like, there's only 2 options. Either there's something or there's nothing, right? Any other option would automatically fall into one of those categories. And when you have a true dichotomy, you get a very curious consequence, which is that if one of the options is not possible, the other one is always true. So the first step is nothingness is, by its very definition, analytically impossible. Like, for it to exist is for it to contradict itself. And if that's true, which I think is really one of the most concrete, I think that's one of the most concrete conclusions that anyone could ever come to, that nothingness is not possible. If that is true, then what that means is that existence never needed to be caused is always the case. Yeah, existence is necessary. Something specifically, something is necessary. Some ground. It gives us the outcome of a contingency argument or a transcendental argument that there has to be something non-contingent or transcendental. The second step is basically a proposal about what the nature of that something is, right? Which is obviously the name of the theory. It's data and logic, where data is non-contingent, uninterpreted information, and logic is consistent relational structure. Yeah. So that, I think, is real. There's lots of reasons to think that identification makes sense, but actually, how I initially came to it was by starting with the cogito, because that seemed to me to be not the most sure thing I could conceive of. Yeah. But however, I don't actually agree with the conclusion that, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am, so thus I exist. To me, because of considerations like, Descartes' demon and the Matrix, the concept I, could be totally uncoupled from what the true nature of things. So really, the only thing you are justified, I think, from concluding from that is something. There has to be something that's true. There has to be something that exists in order that I can be here experiencing this, thinking, doubting, specifically. Yeah, and then it's just, like I said, it's a question of what the nature of that something is. And what I tried to do was just basically ask myself what are the presuppositions without which the cogito wouldn't stand, basically, and it seems like to be as general as possible, I think, right, it's an example of some data. There's some data, right? And then obviously, therefore, these are invocations of logic, right? And so then for me, it's a question of trying to spell out what are the assumptions entailed by, for instance, the use of logic, something like that. Which, in the theory, I go on to explain, like, the way I contextualize logic as a subjective system of reasoning is as a derivative consequence of the structural regularity of the world. Like, and in some sense, that seems it's like duh, because like obviously evolution would predispose us to map the sort of the regularities that are actually there, and then that's what we would obviously that would become the basis of whatever we call logic. Yeah.
Interesting.
So that's
Uh,
step 2.
That's step
Sorry.
2. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. And then there's step 3.
Yeah, step 3 is basically if you accept that the basis of existence is data and logic, so the essence of existence, what it's made of, that's then basically it goes like this. It's like then the data is both logically possible and like absolutely real, right? Like non-contingent, exceptionless. Like there's no possible way for it to ever be false. It doesn't depend on anything else, So it's not only logically possible, but it's absolutely real. Then my thought is, relative to that, there would be data which is logically possible but not absolutely real. We might call that theoretical data. That would be like all the logically possible ways things could be, basically. And this
Okay,
world
so
is one of those ways.
how do you prove? Because first off, how do you escape or do away with or reconcile the infinite regress there? So what is data? Would be the point
Well,
here,
that's the
and
thing is,
then
data is non-contingent, uninterpreted information.
okay, and if you're getting away from the cogito, uh, how then do you go and logically prove that that data is true or real or absolute? Because you see what I mean. You need you have the observer effect. You have to deal with consciousness on some level, because that which
Yeah.
is interpreting the fundamental nature of reality. Like, how do you deal with that aspect?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The purpose of getting away from the cogito is like to extract out the presuppositions inherent in that piece of reasoning. I'm not getting away from consciousness. Obviously, that's not possible. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to distill out without which the statement couldn't make sense, basically.
Sure. Yeah, I know what you mean. And this is where things get kind of confusing, right? Because, and this is what I love about metaphysics. At some point, you have to realize that you're trying to check your definitions against someone else's, and so whether we agree or disagree, really is it all comes down to semantics at some point, and so I think here we have to be very careful, and I'm going to try to parse out what it is that I'm trying to get at. But to me, so far, it sounds like you have a very material reductionist view, but you're employing what is, I guess, more formally known as dual aspect monism. There
Yep.
seems to be a dual aspect to the monistic um, fundamental nature of reality that you're drawing like picture. So that data logic would, those are the dual aspects of the entity that they form, if you will. But
Yep.
but ultimately, what I believe is important, and in what really where the game begins, is to try to reconcile that infinite regress, because you know, when we talk about something absolute and we want to reach an absolute, it means unquestionable, right? I would imagine that that's what people are trying to.
It means without exception.
Exactly, without exception. So to achieve that, I think it's important to get away from that infinitely regressive question. You could say then, what is that
what's the
data
infinite?
logic, right?
Yeah, what's the infinite regress exactly? Because from my perspective, to define one of the elements as non-contingent is already to halt the regression. You can't have a regression at that point.
Sure, I know what you mean, but when the moment that you give a qualia to whatever it is that is non-contingent, and the quality you've given it is data logic, at that point it becomes the infinite regress steps in, because you have to ask, well, what is that? What is data? And it's that which is non-contingent, but that becomes
No, it's not just. That's the thing is, it's not just that which is
no?
non-contingent.
Okay.
It's non-contingent, uninterpreted information. So the secondary assumption is that something like that the world is there before you come along and look at it.
Yeah, so
Right?
that's where consciousness comes in, right? You say uninterpreted, meaning you've isolated consciousness as well. So you've gotten away from
not that I've isolated
no?
consciousness. Just again, just the
Okay.
just the commonplace idea that the world is there before you come along and look at it. Like the world is made up of information, what we would call information, even though strictly speaking, what information means is data that you've used to inform yourself about how things are, right? The world is made up of stuff, and you come along and observe that stuff. Its existence doesn't depend on you observing it.
No, I understand. Yeah, it's an existentialist point of view, but that's why I'm curious. So now, we are talking about consciousness and you interpreting all this stuff, how does it fit in? And also because we come in to ask the question and interpret things, which that's where infinite regress also steps in, because you have to ask, well, what is this data logic that we are now interpreting? And that's where I'm saying that the game is sort of beginning.
I'm not really seeing the infinite regression. Maybe Alex can help me.
Sure.
Because like
I don't know. Alex, do you have any? Maybe I'm also maybe we're talking past each other. Or...
Yeah, I'm feeling like maybe the data logic ontological aspect is separate from the idea of the observer and the observing a reality that already exists. So the ontological aspect of data logic is regardless of observers or not. But then there's kind of an analogy to use with humans looking at the universe and seeing stuff, but it already existing.
oh yeah,
So I'm
yeah,
imagining data. I'm wondering
yeah.
whether there's a disconnect where you're thinking of how it relates to more to humans, James.
Maybe I can make the analogy more clear. So the analogy is along the lines of this: fossils exist in the ground before we come along and dig them up. I would say most people would agree with that statement. We don't make them be there by digging them up. We don't like put them there. They're already there. That's how we discover them to begin with. And more generally, a scientific picture of the universe, the current modern scientific picture of the universe, tells us that the universe existed long before life forms like us did. So a normal stipulation of, I would say a stipulation of the average person's, uninformed philosophical view that I think is quite reasonable is the world doesn't depend on the mind in order to exist. In some sense, it seems, at least insofar as what we mean by mind is creatures such as we, the mind seems to depend on the world. And so where we would call it, for us it might be information, the basic premise is that like existence more generally is made up of stuff that it doesn't depend upon being interpreted to be there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Okay, I understand. Yeah, I think it's an existentialist point of view, and so you would say then, am I correct in assuming that you believe that consciousness then emerges out of that stuff?
Something like that. I mean, I'm quite open-minded about the exact nature of consciousness. I think it is plausible that everything might have some level of consciousness, but certainly the idea of it emerging, that seems to be the best kind of explanation I can see for the kind of consciousness that I'm most familiar with. That is the kind of consciousness that you and I have.
Mhm. Yeah, and so that consciousness, so that has manifested in you personally, and it has led to this specific theory that views um, reality as something that is uninterpreted at base, and that it is data and logic. Uh, is so is your theory a comprehensive logical proof of that? Whereas it wouldn't depend on the consciousness interpreting it; it can stand on its own.
I would think so, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
And
So I'll have
and
to
more
keep reading more,
specifically,
obviously.
I wouldn't necessarily use the word logical proof. What I would say is that the explanation works whether it's interpreted by any mind or not. That's the thing that seems to me to be in this area, in this domain, a mark of truth. It's not so much a logical proof, because in some sense, proof in that respect seems beyond the pale for this kind of subject. But
Yeah,
I'm more concerned with, does the explanation do the job? Does it make sense of the puzzles? And how well does it do that? Is it simple? Does it seem intuitive? These, to me, are the kind of questions that we're hoping a metaphysics is going to answer.
that's right. So, Matthew, this is why I'm trying to probe and test it, because on its own, from what I'm seeing, it seems very. So the fact that we are around to interpret it, and that's why I think it becomes not problematic, but it's a challenge that anybody can
Yeah.
come around and then. So I think that on its own, if it makes a good job of making things simple and you can intuitively grasp it, and it's logically it stands on its own. Um, However, this is where I come in with my own sort of ideas, really. But when it comes to the fact that we're around to discuss it and the fact that we somehow have an intuitive, and perhaps it's the most a priori knowledge that we have, um, and it's very intuitive to us, which would be nothingness. So we're like your entire theory is based on refuting nothingness, but it's a paradox that emerges because you're bringing it into existence. Like if it stands on its own, right? Then why does it necessitate the idea of nothingness? Why is it
Well, it
contingent
doesn't.
on?
That's the thing, is it doesn't, and this is actually where I wanted to get, because it's not
Sure.
contingent on it, and that actually is what I see as kind of the problem with the idea of, like, the phrasing I remember you using is the self-refuting nature of nothingness. Now that occasions a view, and this is actually a view that at one point I held, and it's only through like long, hard work trying to make this rigorous that it occurred to me that there was actually something wrong with the frame. But one way of thinking about it is that the impossibility of nothingness causes things to exist, right? And this, I think, is kind of of a piece with the way that you were just talking about it just now, which is
Yeah.
like a bootstrapping idea up out of it. It's a contingency on nothingness in its impossibility in order to like kickstart things or something like that. But actually, obviously, as you say, that's problematic. That's logically problematic. And actually, it's not that. It's that existence is eternal because nothingness is impossible. Nothingness does not play a causal role. Existence is not contingent on the impossibility of nothing. Existence is eternal because there are not any logically possible alternatives.
Sure. Yeah, and then that's where you get the idea that logic is fundamental. But so this is where and here's I want to be very careful. It's very understandable that that would be the point of view that you have, of course. And here's where it's going to become a bit strange because I in my worldview, I completely agree with the logic of the refutation of nothingness and everything that you've put out there, at least insofar as the distilled version. But I'm also capable of, at the same time, disagreeing, and that's where, to me, I see things in a paradoxical manner because you know you are still employing the notion or concept of nothingness, and whatever it means is the challenge, right? What is that nothingness, or
Yeah.
if it's nothing?
Well, I don't
So
think it's problematic to employ the concept, to be clear.
I don't
The
think it's
concept,
well. Hold on, I'll just finish there. So,
yeah.
to me, it's a challenge, but the moment that you um, invoke the idea of void or nothingness whatsoever, you are stepping into that not problem or challenge. So, to me, the question, if I could boil it down, would be, why is your theory mention it at all whatsoever?
Well, because it's conceptually relevant to the problem, and it's the concept of nothing with which I'm dealing, and I'm of the firm opinion that I captured what people mean by the concept adequately. And although the concept, if like taken to a logical extreme, would, let's say, necessitate the absence of the concept, The reality is that as human beings, we're capable of sustaining such tension within our ideas, and the concept of nothingness is not so logically problematic that you cannot work with it to some degree. That's what I'm doing in the proofs. And I think most people would say that what's going on there is that I'm exposing an incompatibility between our concepts of nothingness and our concept of existence.
Absolutely. And that's where so this is why I say you do a good job of showing and like delineating nothingness from existence, but but it's still a delineation that you're making, which invokes its existence, and that's where the paradox comes in. So
No, it doesn't.
hold
This
on,
is the thing
hold on.
I find confusing
Just
because
just wait, hear me out. So this is something that I'm pretty much from what I know. I don't know. I still don't know where Alex stands on this, but in this community, I'm pretty much the only one who still stands in that camp that says, because I'm just not willing. I'm not willing to say that void exists ontologically. What I'm trying to say is we can't sweep it under like logically delineating its self-refutation is just not sufficient to do away with it. Like the whole reason we're talking
yeah,
about it is it should tell us that hey, there's something important going on here, and it points to consciousness. Like so, you can logically isolate it, you can refute it in many ways, and I think you've done a good job, and it should be that way. And what I'm saying is there's a paraconsistent logic at play here, and of course you'll see that there's our entire fields like Graham Priest recently was on the Toe podcast, and he deals with nothingness in many interesting ways. There's also fuzzy logic and other paraconsistent logics that deal with nothingness. So really, the idea that you can delineate logically delineate existence from nothingness, and it's self-contained and it's consistent and has its own integrity and all that. I think it, it it it's part of a larger picture, and that's why I have to ask you, like, where so far I think not that you've failed, but that there's still more to be said about your theory is, what is to be said about consciousness, and consciousness is the um the thing that makes everything so challenging because we're the ones who are interpreting everything, and you can say that we're interpreting it by just erroneously, which is another way of delineating nothingness, and then separating it from everything or doing away with it logically, but yet it's still so intuitive and it's still such an a priori thing. Like if you think behind, you think about before your consciousness, before your birth, there seems to be something there, and of course there are many explanations that can do away with that as well. But ultimately, is consciousness creating the concept of nothingness in order to justify or give
okay.
some kind of differentiation to existence, or give existence at least its qualities, or you know what I mean?
I mean, so I want to respond to that, and then I have something else I want to say in response as well. From my perspective, how I would trace the concept of nothingness, even in its like metaphysical, primal, essential form, is for me. It begins in it's a normal cognitive process of abstraction. We begin with relative absence, namely something that exists and not only exists, but we know is present somewhere, but is not here and now. So something is missing, something is absent. With respect to that thing, nothing is there. Okay, and then we have a normal cognitive operation, which is abstraction, namely to ask, okay, well, what about the concept of things not being there? Right, that's one step in the abstraction, things not being there. We would call that the concept of absence, the concept of nothingness.
Or
Right?
relative absence.
Well, no,
Relative
absence. Relative absence is relative to a specific actual thing. The concept of absence is the abstraction of relative absence
Okay, I get it.
into the notion of an unspecified thing, or things in general, perhaps. Yeah, an unspecified number of things being absent. And then you can even take that one step further and ask, what if nothingness were not just a concept? Okay? And my point is that relative absence makes perfect sense. The concept of absence is logically problematic but workable, the notion of it not just being a concept is totally a non-starter.
Sure.
And like,
Yeah, absolutely. A non so to me, the idea of something being a non-starter actually gives the quality of absoluteness to me. It's a
yeah,
plausible
so,
absoluteness. So this
yeah,
is
that
why I think the entire idea of metaphysics rests on.
yeah,
So if you're going to use duality to
yep,
synthesize
yep,
your way into an absolute,
yep,
you're going to require that other concept, which is why I'm
yep,
saying it becomes relevant
excellent.
right away.
Yes. So
And so
that's what that was the second response I wanted to
yeah.
offer. So I did actually link this essay in the TOE Discord. It's called Masculine Metaphysics. But what my focus is in this essay is to try to do justice to the point of view that does take nothingness as the ground. And so I'd like to read like my attempt to steelman that idea. Would you like to hear
Mhm.
it?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So this is basically what I've done in the essay is sort of laid out a framework, and then eventually I articulate the masculine DM theorem, which is that's just what we've been talking about this whole time. Because what I mean by masculine is presence-based metaphysics, things being their isness stuff, presence-based. And the feminine metaphysic is emptiness, creative emptiness idea, right? Anyway, here it is. The feminine DM theorem equals nothingness is the ground of being. It is self-contradictory, and this results in an inner tension that renders it unstable. That instability has the curious consequence of generating a superposition of all possibilities, any one of which might crystallize, but none of which is truly real. Thus, it is the contradictory nature of nothingness which generates the creative tension that catalyzes the momentary manifestation of a phenomenal world, a world of seeming and appearing to be, a world furnished through quote-unquote concrete objects, which therefore belies its quote-unquote essence as something which is essentially lacking in such a thing. Thus, if there's no rules, anything can happen. Simply put, if there's nothing, then there's no rules, and if there's no rules, then there's nothing to prevent the manifestation of anything which might have been or might yet be.
Okay. So to me, that sounds a lot like nothingness is extremely relevant, but there's a superposition there. And so let me ask you another question, so we don't go down the rabbit hole too much. When you say that nothingness in that absolute manner is the most nonsensical thing, by that, do you mean that it is the most illogical thing? Therefore, it does not exist.
I mean that it's logically impossible. That's
It's
what I mean.
logically impossible. Okay, great. So this is what I'm saying is but by the framework of logic, it is impossible, right? The law of the excluded
Yep.
middle demands it. And yet, with antinomy, we see that the impossible is rendered possible. And not only just conceptually, it seems that we've been able to observe that, within nature as well. So, this is why I'm thinking like there's no that we have to be very very careful not to fall into, I would say, one that very easy emotional ego thing to try to defend our camps, but two, to be very careful to beyond that, once we've mastered that ability to stay rational about it, to come together and try to make sure that we are very consistent with our definitions of things. I think people far too often overlook this basic step, which is the most crucial, which is to define things very clearly, very well.
Yep.
And I think so far you've done some good job of elaborating more on these words that we're using. Like it is necessary to parse out conceptual
Yeah.
nothingness from relative nothingness from this
Yeah. Just to
third
be clear,
absolute nothingness. Yeah.
in the full paper, not only do I do that, I walk the reader through that systematically, but there's also a glossary where I give a clear, as clear as I can, definition of every term I use. And also there's a section in between the introduction and the 3 steps, which is obviously missing in the distilled version, which goes over some of those key terms and articulates part of the conceptual framework that I'm employing.
I'd have to. So again, this is why we may have jumped the gun to just have the conversation without us reading the rest of your stuff. But um, I think that there's something important here because this is where we all get bogged down. We're actually getting down to the crux of things, I think, in this community where we're really, really, um, and maybe I'm just playing that part, which is, I'm just picking up the slack in that manner of saying, well, no, we're dealing with nothingness. Like, I'll play devil's advocate on it, because really, when we start to talk about uh, what it means. Now, when we're trying to derive meaning out of these things, that's when we all seem to synchronize. Like when we get down to the logic of it, and we're discussing the analytical, like the analytic aspect of it, the semantics, it's very easy to get bogged down in complexity and argumentation and. But then, as soon as we move up from there and try to extract meaning, we're like, "Wow, yeah, that we're on the same page." So that's what I'm trying to map out. That's what I'm trying to understand. Um, and so what I think would be necessary is for us to come together at some point, and we're actually going to do it step by step in the most sequential manner possible, where we're really saying, okay, let's lay out all the words, all the terms. Like I actually have that in my notes right here for this interview. I prepared a little bit. Like we could define what we mean by truth, what we mean by data, what we mean by logic, what we mean by existence, all of this stuff. Because within each word, there's perhaps an entire conversation or field or epistemological mapping that needs to be done. For example, eternity and infinity, we're discussing, we need to discuss qualia, we need to discuss consciousness. When we're discussing words like superposition, we need to understand the difference between like what is monism, what is dualism, what does it mean for things to be differentiated and all that. So do you see what I mean? Like there's this whole tree that expands outwards, and we've just scratched the surface. We've just sort of opened the can, and it's messy things fall out, right? But so I'll try to build that picture a little bit more with you by asking you, when you say eternal and when you use the word infinite in your theory, what do you mean by that? And I'll tell you to get started, because to me, eternal means that there's no differentiate. It's undifferentiated reality. It's beyond spatio-temporal qualities. And then infinity is where you start to bring in relativity, where you start to bring in the differentiations or discrete units of data. And that leads me to a second question. So the first question is that's my definition of them. I'm curious how yours differs or if it's the same. And then I have a very specific question, which would be, do you consider that data logic to be one unit or many units, like just an entire world of infinite differentiations?
It's two and one and many at the same time. As
okay.
for so for me, eternity definitely doesn't mean undifferentiated. It means beyond time. It means such that it couldn't fail to be the case. That's what eternal means to me. Something eternal couldn't fail to be true ever, in any situation, under any circumstances. No
Absoluteness, absolute non-contingency.
Yeah, but specifically with respect to like what eternal has the sense of relating to time, so means beyond time, basically.
But what is that? So what is beyond time?
Well, I would say like the multiverse, for example, which for me is an aspect of data logic.
More data, more logic.
Yeah, an aspect of data logic. I don't use the term infinity in my theory. I don't like the term infinity. I think it's confusing. If I were to talk about that number phenomenon that people mean by infinity, I refer to that as endless sets. So there's endless sets, and there's various sizes of these endless sets.
Okay.
I think that's more precise.
How do you view this data logic, if that's the absolute fundamental aspect of reality in your theory? Is it like one discrete unit or is it a collection of infinite units in a way?
It is.
Is it binary or non-binary?
It's one and two at the same time. It
Okay.
is two aspects that are inextricably bound together into
Yeah.
one thing.
And that's really the seed to why I view the world as paradoxical. There seems to be an antinomy at play that
Yep.
prevents us from either selecting a material reductionist point of view or a transcendental point of view. Like it cannot be one or the other. It has to be both. And so to me, the only way to speak in absolute terms would be to see the superposition of the two. That would be the most like cleanest, logically cleanest way to say it. Because the moment that we start to say, well, yeah, it's one and two, then you have to start to parse out
Like
that we're,
that's the
or
thing
you know what I
is,
mean?
in terms of like theoretical talk, I mean, I'm happy to abide by that, but the reality is that when we get to any practical philosophical matter, both of us are going to just be talking about one side of that equation. So, and that's the thing is,
But
because
that's
of
what I want
that,
to get away from. Sorry, Matthew, that's where I have to disagree. Just an interject real quick. I'm trying to get away from that. Like you just said, that's I'm trying to get away from having to speak from one side of the aisle or the other. That's
well,
why
I guess what I mean is,
paradoxism is.
I
Yeah,
guess what I mean, I was referring to what you said about deriving meaning. It just is the case that a nothingness-based view doesn't let you make sense very well. That's just the reality of it. Like,
absolutely. Yeah.
okay, so if what we're interested in doing philosophically is making sense, then as soon as we get into anything substantial, both of us are just going to ignore the half of the equation that is related to nothingness, because that, for the most part, is just going to generate nonsense.
Okay, so this is where I would. This is beautiful. Okay, so if your goal is to make sense, that's great. I think I would agree with you. But my goal, and I believe what a lot of other people's goal might be, and this is where we might have this problem. People don't even realize that hey, we're just not even pursuing the same goal here, so it's kind of useless. But to me, is to try to prove or reach some kind of absolute understanding or comprehensive boiling down or essential quintessential idea or understanding of reality, that you can grasp. So you can, and it doesn't have to make sense. To me, I think the moment you think it has to make sense to standard logic, you've quite
I
limited
think that
yourself, because
I
there's
think
so much more that doesn't make sense and yet still
yeah,
is. So that when you're
yeah,
talking about the complexity of being and fundamental nature and all these grand ideas, there's a need to include that which is illogical as
yeah.
well.
For me, that does it's not that you're wrong about there's a need to include that in general. I just think it just doesn't belong in metaphysics. Like for
Well,
me, I
that's the
have I
metaphysical like debate from the beginning, right? Like we can we
well,
can
no, but
argue that.
my thought is
Yeah,
that like um that the side, if you're looking for a distillation, then it has to be one-sided, because one side won't be distilled. That's the reality of it. So, and my thought is that you distill the side that's distillable and then develop a different framework, because you're a complex being, you're capable of employing more than one framework. You develop a different framework to respond to the parts of the world that seem to you to be beyond reason or illogical or nonsense, or
yeah,
to
I
me
understand.
there's a way of including that that doesn't involve compromising on ontology.
It seems to me that there might be a line to be drawn here between utility and meaning, because I think from your perspective, it seems like you're operating under the motivation that everything has to have some kind of utility to it, whereas I see meaning that goes beyond utility as the primary motivator, at least for myself personally, and I think for many other people,
I,
because really the question that I would have for you beyond that, the sort of just to want to throw that out there to make it known, is is more of a question, I guess. the fact that it's possible to behave illogically, you have cognitive dissonance, you have just many examples in practical everyday life as well. But even just the fact that it's possible to think or be illogical, how does that fit into your theory, that really ultimate truth is completely logical?
To respond to the first thing you said, I
Sure, sure.
definitely the highest value for me is not utility. It's just that utility is a very reliable marker of truth. Truth is for me what matters, and I would identify that with meaning. For me, what I'm interested in is in a description of the world that meaningfully represents what's actually going on.
I
What was that
understand. Okay, I didn't, just to make sure, I didn't mean to put words in your mouth or put
No,
you in
no,
the trig bag there. Yeah, so I understand now. Yeah, I know what you mean. But yeah, this is, I think, what from someone from the essentialist point of view, for them, I guess what I just did is a great example. Is I've separated meaning from utility, or utility from meaning, and I think it reflects, like, at the end of the day, we're both after the same things, I think, is what you're saying, and yet it's possible to be after the same thing from two different points of view.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Um,
actually yeah. Sorry, what was the second question though? I
So
don't
yeah,
want
the
to get
second
lost.
question that I wanted to know was, if everything is data logic, which, by the way, I quite like
Oh
that
yeah,
term.
yeah.
The
Yeah.
data logic, it gives, it's kind of like space time, or matter
Yeah.
energy. I like the dual aspect of the same thing. It's kind of like in German too. They say Jein, so ja and nein, yes and no. So you can really marry the two, and I quite very fond of that as a dual aspect bonus. But anyway, okay. So my question is, if really data logic is the absolute cleanest fundamental truth that we can arrive at conclusively, where does everything that is illogical fit in?
Like, I guess what I would say is that there's a certain level of complexity that begins to allow degrees of freedom within which you can have what you might call illogicality. The reality is that that whatever illogical behavior you have, it's all contextualized within the logic of the environment in a consistent way. Like, there are reasons that you behave illogically. What even if you don't know what they are, there are reasons. It's not like a reasonless
Okay.
thing.
So if you extend that outward, is it then logically, does that mean that, well, can I distill it by saying this? Are you then saying that if there are things that seem illogical to us because we don't have the capacity to understand it as logical to our own framework, uh, that ultimately that what is illogical is logical? At least what is illogical to us and yet still exists is still logical.
Yes, in that form, yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay,
And
so
obviously the contentious
that's,
part of that sentence would be "and still exists," right?
well, exactly. So it's existential, and just because there is no other option, right? We're talking about
Yeah.
it as an absolute. So this is why I say, well, if we can think about or conceptualize the most nonsensical thing according to your theory, which is nothingness, as an absolute,
Oh yeah,
then
but okay,
isn't
but
that apply in the
okay,
sense that it's
yeah.
illogical and yet is possible?
That's the thing is this is a great window into it actually, because it's possible to conceptualize. That's the point. And obviously it's possible to conceptualize. Here we are after all. So within the logic of creatures such as within like we're fit to the environment evolutionarily, right? Our like faculties are adaptive. It's not like we don't just do whatever, right? Um
Sure, yeah. But why is it like, so if it is logical, if everything is reduced to being logical, including that which is illogical, then can we not just say that it is logical to think about nothingness or
Sure,
conceptualize it?
it's logical to think about it. It's also logical to conclude that it can't exist.
Sure, yeah, both. That's what I'm saying. Like both are
But
possible, and
what I'm saying is that doesn't give us a
it
commitment
gives
to
us an
the
axis of
existence.
truth, right? It gives us
It doesn't know what I'm
degrees of
saying.
truth, or not truth,
Okay,
sorry, of
yes,
of
It
freedom,
tells
like
us
you said. Yeah.
something. Yeah, but it doesn't. Our belief there, what that tells us is about our use of the concept. It doesn't tell us about like it doesn't reveal a commitment to the ontological existence of nothingness when we, for instance, have the concept and then affirm that the concept is not possible. That doesn't reveal a hidden commitment to the existence of that. Yeah, that's the thing.
I'm not sure I understand.
Okay, so when we're talking about nothingness being impossible, what we're fundamentally having a discussion about is a concept, because there isn't an object that it doesn't refer to an object. Like when we try to imagine the object, we basically run into a brain error, right? So the conversation focuses on the concept, which is an abstraction of instances of relative nothing. Part of what I understood you to be saying earlier was that, in some sense, isn't it contradictory? Because by having a concept, aren't we ontologically committed to nothingness?
Yes, well, and this is where, to me, if you're going to say that an absolute is it comprises everything. By absolute, we mean that it is absolute. So it therefore um, it is comprehensive insofar as that it can include that which is illogical. At that point, I would say,
Okay. I feel like here is where we're having a difficulty, because
yeah,
the nature isn't the thing is that what the question fundamentally boils down to what it is that's absolute. So if the thing that is thought to be absolute is for instance data logic, you can see how the like the, the constraint there is anything logically possible. And honestly, the idea of an absolute that can contain within itself even impossibilities, I don't even know what we're talking about at that point. Like the only concept of the absolute I can even get on board with is something that includes all things that are possible, not everything that's not. There has to be a line somewhere.
sure, but that's I think where the whole game begins, where we're trying to understand where is that line. But what you do is you seem to delineate that line quite well for existence, insofar as that um, you use data logic as the marker or the baseline, but to me it's arbitrary. I mean, you could use anything. At the end of the day, we know that we have
Well,
to we have to tap into this idea of eternity, or something is eternal. Now, the moment that we try to describe anything, and this is where we get into Wittgenstein a little bit, but language becomes problematic and everything. And are we mapping the territory and therefore not even being, so all those questions kind of come in. But if we're around to discuss this stuff anyway, we might as well do the best job that we can. And so that's where I would say, by
oh,
virtue of absolute, if an absolute really does mean everything that is comprehensive, including
yeah.
illogical things and other paraconsistent logics and everything, then really using, so maybe it's just a matter of semantics or personal
I think
preference,
I
or I don't
think
know,
the
because like
sticking
we're
I think
talking
the
so
sticking
much
point.
about nothingness and existence, and at the end of the day, um, if the selection here, the goal is to achieve, did we let's back up before we go a bit further. Let's
I
select
think
a purpose here. Are we trying to achieve meaning or truth or both, and what does that mean in the context of this conversation?
meaning, truth, sure, accuracy. I'd like to make sure we're
And
making
how do you
sense.
define truth?
For me, truth ultimately refers to the thing, the object of existence, the thing in itself, the way
So
things are.